Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is Pro Revenge Story. This is a very old revenge from when I was a teenager in the 2010s. There were only a few dedicated PC gamers around at the time, and without good internet connections in our rural area, it was hard to get hold of new games. My friend Alex and I bought digital game codes from overseas websites because local stores didn't sell many, but these weren't cheap. We'd trade access to our Steam libraries with each other and would share the DRM workarounds, so this made it semi-affordable for us. A new kid named Tyler joined our class, however, and his uncle had tons and tons of games we didn't have. We offered to trade games with him and gave him access to our Steam libraries for him to download, and in return we got corrupted download links, missing activation codes, etc. After a few months of this, we had received not a single working game while he had gotten all of our games, Cities, Skylines, Portal 2, The Walking Dead series, etc. And some he even somehow managed to mess with our accounts. "Dude, what happened to my Walking Dead save files?" I asked him one day after school. Tyler just shrugged. "No idea, man. Maybe your computer's just trash. We had enough, and we wanted to get revenge, but we didn't know how." Now, the 2010s were known for many HIV awareness campaigns after several celebrities came out as HIV positive around 2015. I was a huge fan of these awareness-raising musicians, and this new friend would often mock me for liking those people. He'd make crude jokes whenever I mentioned my favorite bands. "Why do you even listen to that gay stuff?" he'd sneer during lunch breaks. Tyler came from a very conservative family, and his mother was quite religious. This gave us an idea when we had to attend an HIV awareness event organized by a certain foundation with our class. At the end, we were given flyers about HIV, sexual health, etc., and free condoms with the logo of the foundation were available to take. We each grabbed a few for reasons you'll soon discover below. Alex and I were among the very few with decent printers at home, so we got this idea to screw Tyler over. We created a fake letter addressed to him, pretending we were the HIV Foundation, copying the logo and everything to make it look as authentic as possible. It went something like this. "Dear Tyler, thank you for your letter. We understand it's difficult being open about being homosexual, and you have many questions after the event you attended with your class. Please find enclosed a flyer which should answer many of your questions as well as some condoms. Please practice safe sex at all times." We enclosed all the flyers we had gotten at the event as well as the condoms and mailed it to Mr. Davidson to guarantee his father would open the letter first. "Do you think this will actually work?" Alex asked as we dropped the envelope in the mailbox. "Only one way to find out," I replied with a nervous grin. We had no idea the crapstorm this would create. We knew that with his homophobic attitudes, this would be great revenge. But apparently, his mother had been in tears, screaming, his father angry, and he was grounded for weeks with his parents convinced he was gay. The Monday after we sent the letter, Tyler was absent from school. When he finally returned 3 days later, he looked miserable. "What's wrong with you?" I asked, feigning concern. "Nothing," he muttered, refusing to make eye contact. "Family stuff." In the end, he figured we had something to do with it because we had been carefully fishing to see if our prank had succeeded, but at first he thought the letter was authentic and we had contacted the foundation in his name. When we finally confessed we had faked it all, we had a nice trip to the principal to explain why we had done this with his parents present. "What were you thinking?" the principal demanded, glaring at us across her desk. "He scammed us," Alex explained. "He took all our games and never gave us anything that worked in return." Tyler's father turned to him. "Is this true?" Tyler just stared at his shoes. "It's still the best revenge I ever took in my life, even though it was about 10 years ago." The next one is an entitled people story. So, a bit of background. About 5 years ago, my grandfather passed away and left me his property. It was this huge chunk of land out in what used to be the middle of nowhere, about 40 acres total. He'd bought it decades ago for next to nothing, back when the area was just empty fields and the occasional cow. I'd spent summers there as a kid, and honestly, the place held a lot of memories. My grandfather had a small house on one corner of the property, but it was pretty run down by the time I inherited it. I had been living in a cramped apartment in the city, paying way too much rent, so when I got the property, I saw it as an opportunity. The old house was practically falling apart and would have cost a fortune to renovate, so I decided to demolish it and eventually build something new. In the meantime, I bought a really nice RV, one of those fancy fifth-wheel ones, and parked it on my land. It had everything I needed, and honestly, I loved it. No rent, no neighbors blasting music at 2 in the morning, just peace and quiet on my own property. Now here's where things get interesting, and where I was apparently completely oblivious to what had been happening around me. Years before my grandfather died, he'd sold off about 20 acres on the far side of his property to a development company. I vaguely knew about this from family discussions, but I never paid much attention to the details. That 20 acres got turned into a planned community, one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods with identical houses and strict rules about what color you can paint your mailbox. They called it Meadowbrook Estates, which was hilarious because there was no meadow and no brook anywhere nearby. The development had its own HOA, which governed those 20 acres and the houses built on them. My remaining 20 acres, where I was living in my RV, was completely separate. Different parcel, different everything. I had my own driveway entrance on a different road, my own utilities, the whole deal. There was technically a property line between us, marked by an old fence my grandfather had put up, but you could barely see it through the overgrown bushes. I'd been living there peacefully for about 8 months when I got my first letter from the HOA. It was addressed to the resident at my address and informed me that I was in violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA bylaws, which prohibited residents from using recreational vehicles as primary residences. The letter stated that I had 30 days to remove the RV, or I would face fines of $200 per day. I was confused at first, then I laughed it off. Obviously, this was a mistake. I didn't live in Meadowbrook Estates. I didn't live in their HOA. I lived on my own private property that had nothing to do with them. I figured I'd just ignore it and they'd realize their error. They did not realize their error. 2 weeks later, I got another letter. This one was more aggressive, stating that I had failed to respond to their previous notice and that I was now accruing fines. They'd apparently driven by and taken photos of my RV, which they included as evidence of my violation. The letter mentioned that if I didn't comply, they'd take legal action to enforce the HOA rules. At this point, I was annoyed enough to actually respond. I wrote them a simple email explaining that I wasn't part of their HOA, that I owned my own separate property, and that they had no jurisdiction over what I did on my land. I thought that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. The HOA president, some guy who apparently had nothing better to do with his time, showed up at my property one Saturday morning. He knocked on my RV door, and when I answered, he started lecturing me about property values and community standards. He said that even though I claimed not to be part of the HOA, my RV was an eyesore that was bringing down values for the whole neighborhood. He demanded that I remove it immediately or face escalating fines and legal action. I told him, as politely as I could manage, that he could take his fines and his legal threats and shove them where the sun doesn't shine. He left in a huff, and I figured that would finally be the end of it. You can probably guess that it wasn't. The letters kept coming, and the claimed fines kept adding up. They were now saying I owed them over $5,000 in accumulated violations. They sent me copies of their bylaws, architectural guidelines, and a bunch of other documents that I didn't bother reading because none of it applied to me. They even sent someone to put a notice on my RV like I was being evicted or something. Finally, they made their biggest mistake. They sent me a letter from their lawyer threatening to put a lien on my property if I didn't pay the fines and remove the RV. That was when I decided I'd had enough and needed to lawyer up myself. I found a real estate attorney in town and brought her all the documentation I had about my property. We sat down and went through everything, including the deeds, the survey maps, and the history of the land. That's when things got really interesting. My attorney started digging into the original sale that my grandfather had made to the development company. She pulled up all the paperwork, and we discovered something absolutely beautiful. My grandfather hadn't actually sold the land to the development company. He'd leased it to them on a 99-year ground lease. And not just any lease, but one with very specific terms that I'd never known about. According to the lease agreement, the development company and any subsequent homeowners had the right to build on and occupy the land, but my family retained ownership of the actual land underneath. The lease had annual payments that were supposed to be made to the landowner, payments that I'd never received because nobody had bothered to tell me about them when I inherited the property. The development company had apparently been paying them to my grandfather for years, but after he died, they just stopped, probably hoping nobody would notice. But here's the best part. The lease agreement had a clause that stated if the lease payments weren't made for more than 2 years, the landowner had the right to terminate the lease with 6 months' notice. They hadn't paid me in almost 3 years. My attorney sent a very formal letter to the HOA, the development company, and their lawyer. The letter explained that I was the actual owner of the land their entire community sat on, that they were in breach of the lease agreement, and that if they continued to harass me or tried to enforce their ridiculous fines, I would terminate the lease and they would all have to leave. The response was immediate and hilarious. The HOA president called me directly, suddenly very friendly, apologizing profusely for the misunderstanding. He said they'd had no idea about the lease situation and that, of course, they'd never dream of telling me what to do on my own property. He asked if we could just forget the whole thing and move forward as good neighbors. I told him I'd think about it. And I did think about it. I thought about all the threatening letters, the harassment, the fines, the lawyer fees I'd had to pay, and that smug lecture I'd gotten on my own doorstep. I thought about how they'd assumed they could push around someone they thought was just some guy in an RV, not even bothering to check if they had any right to do what they were doing. So I decided on some malicious compliance. They wanted me to follow rules and pay fees? Fine. I'd follow the rules that actually applied to this situation, the ones in the lease agreement. I had my attorney send another letter. This one informed them that while I was willing to continue the lease arrangement, I would be enforcing all the terms of the agreement going forward. First, they owed me 3 years of back payments on the ground lease, with interest, which came to a pretty substantial sum. Second, the lease included a clause that allowed me to approve or deny any major changes to the property, including new construction, which they'd been doing without my permission. Every house built in the last 3 years was technically in violation of the lease terms. But here's where the malicious compliance really kicked in. The lease also included language about maintenance of common areas and infrastructure. Specifically, it stated that the leaseholder was responsible for maintaining all roads, utilities, and common facilities on the leased property. However, it also gave me, as the landowner, the right to set standards for that maintenance and to levy additional ground rent if those standards weren't met. I hired an inspector to go through the entire development. We found all sorts of minor issues. Cracks in the roads, a few streetlights that were out, some drainage problems, landscaping that wasn't up to the standards outlined in the lease. I compiled a massive list and sent it to the HOA with a notice that until these issues were resolved, I would be increasing the ground lease payment by 20%. The HOA went ballistic, they tried to argue, they tried to negotiate, they even tried to threaten legal action again. My attorney kindly reminded them that they were living on my land under a lease agreement that they'd been violating for years, and that I had every right to terminate it if they didn't comply with the terms. They paid the back rent, they fixed all the maintenance issues, they started making the annual lease payments on time with a little extra for my trouble. The HOA president sent me a formal written apology and assured me I would never hear from them again about my RV or anything else I chose to do on my portion of the property, but I wasn't quite done. Remember that 20% increase in ground rent I demanded? Well, the lease agreement stated that ground rent increases had to be passed on to the individual homeowners as special assessments. So every single person in Meadowbrook Estates got a surprise bill because their HOA had decided to pick a fight with the guy who literally owned the ground under their houses. The HOA president resigned shortly after that. I heard through the grapevine that a lot of the residents were pretty upset with him for creating such an expensive mess over something as stupid as someone else's RV that wasn't even in their community. They ended up having to hold a special meeting to explain to everyone why their assessments had suddenly gone up, and apparently it did not go well for the board members involved. As for me, I'm still living in my RV on my land, and I eventually did start building my house. The construction is going slowly because I'm doing a lot of it myself, but I'm in no rush. The RV is comfortable, the view is great, and every month I collect a nice check from the HOA for the privilege of existing on land I own. I even waved at the new HOA president the other day when I saw him driving by. He waved back very enthusiastically. Funny how respectful people get when they remember you're their landlord. The whole situation taught me an important lesson about reading the fine print and knowing your rights. It also taught the HOA an expensive lesson about making assumptions and picking fights with people before checking if you actually have any authority over them. They wanted me to comply with their rules, and I did. Just not the rules they thought applied. Sometimes malicious compliance isn't about breaking the rules, it's about enforcing the ones that actually matter. The next one is a petty revenge story. I worked an engineering contract for a while. They were pretty open-ended, like a lot were, with a vague but not binding length specified, kind of like, this contract is expected to be for 12 months, but it is at will of the employer and could end earlier or be extended further. But for those that do that kind of work, usually they stick to the vague timelines, and a lot of well-performing contractors get extended. Anyway, one day our team of 10, all contractors managed by one full-time employee, let 3 of the contractors go, and they had me do it. Technically, I was running that team, but I was a contractor too and not in charge of any firing like that. So they were told, this is your last day at 4 p.m. Me and another contractor asked our sponsor, hey, how come we didn't give those guys any notice? He said brightly, that's why we hire contractors, so we can cut them loose at a moment's notice whenever we want to. We didn't love that answer. Also, it was a weird thing to say to 2 other contractors. He basically told us we'd get no notice and be let go instantly someday. Anyway, long story short, that other contractor was a very sharp guy. He started interviewing and got another job. He told me about it, and I didn't tell anyone else. It started in a few weeks. He just kept right on working the contract job, and was right in the middle of a bunch of work that only he understood. At 5 p.m. on his last day, he just stood up, grabbed his laptop/mouse/docking station, walked to our sponsor's desk and set them down. He just said brightly, "Hey, thanks for everything, this is my last day." The guy said, "Wait, you're leaving?" And he just said, "Yes, thanks," and walked out. That was it. He did also hit send on a more official last day email at the same time, too. It was really funny. His work was half done. He didn't answer any calls or questions about it, and it took us like a month to figure it all out and get that project back on track. If the sponsor hadn't been so delighted about being able to fire contractors at any second, that guy would definitely have given a nice 2-week notice and worked to have a smooth handoff of his work. The next one is a malicious compliance story, the compliance. Years ago, I worked as a junior manufacturing engineer for a certain company building certain relatively complex products, and one of the stations I was responsible for was the first test station. We got the core mechanism and the electronic assembly of the products right off the production line, and I performed white box testing to ensure everything looked right and worked properly before sending it to a different station for assembly and black box testing. I'm trying to avoid talking about the specific testing methodologies used, hence white box and black box, because that's the best way I can describe it without being more specific. White box refers to testing it with direct access to all the internal components, so you can measure all the different parts, verify that individual parts work correctly, etc. Black box refers to testing it after the entire thing has already been put into an enclosure and you no longer have access to the internals, so really you're just verifying that the thing works and does everything it's designed to do. The product I'll talk about today, let's give it a code name of Azure, belongs to the greater family of blue products, which were all very similar but may have had different configurations, slightly different parts, etc. Azure was a new product, and in the first few production runs, we saw failure rates of 20% plus at black box testing, the station after mine. When the engineers dug into it, they found that one of the relays on the electronic control board was fused shut on those 20% of units that failed. For whatever reason, they turned to me, they love blaming my station, and said that my station was causing it. For a bit more background, my white box testing station had powered off and powered on testing. In powered on testing, we turned newly built units on for the first time, which also meant that if anything was wrong with it that would make it fail when powered on, it would fail at my station. That's why I was always careful to make sure that the initial powered off testing was thorough enough to cover as many of my bases as possible, so that when I powered it on for the first time, the unit wouldn't blow up. The design engineering team apparently didn't believe that. They were convinced that when I powered on Azure units for the first time at my station, the initial power surge was sending a big current spike through the relays, which was causing them to fail. Their proposed solution was to simply eliminate powered on testing during white box testing. This was a terrible idea, so I argued against it. 1. The power supply in my test jig is set to be as closely matched as possible to the actual power supplies we send out with these units into the field. That means if there was a power surge that was causing the failures, it's a design issue and would be occurring with units out in the field if I didn't power it on during white box. Design engineering team said that no, it must be an issue with my tester because they didn't believe there could be anything wrong with their design. 2. I pulled up the datasheet for that relay and showed that it was physically impossible for that relay to fuse, in the circuit configuration it was placed in, with the amount of voltage my test jig could supply. Apparently, the design engineers ignored that entire page of my report. They didn't think a junior manufacturing engineer's analysis was even worth looking at, and trusted their own assumptions more. 3. I had yet to see a single unit that was proven to have a good relay before my station and a fused one after my station, which would have been the concrete evidence I needed to believe that my station was fusing the relays. Design engineering said, "We don't need concrete evidence, we're sure this is what's happening." 4. If we disable powered on testing, we'll lose a lot of test coverage. The design engineers just went, "Whatever, we'll catch any issues at black box." This was a bad idea because our black box tester, while it could tell us that the unit wasn't working, could not tell us what part in the assembly was causing it not to work. Units that failed white box had a 70% successful repair rate. Units that failed black box had 10%, at least without going back through white box. 5. Finally, I argued that we had other products in the blue family that went through the exact same test jig, using the exact same relay in the exact same circuit configuration, and hadn't seen any issues before. That last argument I made was a big mistake. What I said was, we have other blue family products going through that same jig with no problems. What the design engineers apparently heard was, we have other blue family products going through that same jig, and they're all killing relays, and Subway Smoothie hasn't noticed yet because he's incompetent. They came back at me twice as hard. I fought this as much as I could for 2 weeks before the order finally came down from my direct manager. As per directives from the design engineering team, all powered-on testing was to be disabled from the test jig for all blue family products, not just Azure. For what it's worth, my manager was on my side for most of this, and only gave me the order to avoid any unnecessary trouble when it looked like the company leadership was going to get involved. Well, fine. I went ahead and disabled powered-on testing. As I predicted, all of the blue family products, cyan, turquoise, cerulean, etc., started seeing 3x the failure rate at black box testing, and we were now stuck with a bunch of units that we didn't know how to fix. But that's besides the point. How about Azure? Same 20% failure rate. Nothing changed. Just as I said, my station wasn't killing the relays. So the design engineers went and took another 3 months figuring out what the actual cause of all of the relay failures was, which, as it turns out, was some flaw with the way the black box test was being run, combined with some other part on the assembly that was under spec. I don't know specifics, I wasn't part of this conversation anymore. They spent a bunch of money and got it fixed, and never followed up with me saying, hey, looks like you were right, it wasn't caused by powered-on testing at Whitebox, which crucially also means that I never got a directive to re-enable powered-on testing, so we ran like that for a few months, me licking my lips all the time because I knew what was coming and it was delicious. The fallout, see, there was another product in the blue family that I'll call Navy. Navy was a bit of an oddball because the client had some requirement that demanded microcontroller B be installed as opposed to microcontroller A on all of the other blue family products. That was the only difference, which meant I used the same test jig for it. We sourced microcontroller A from a vendor who also preloaded it with the firmware we needed flashed on it. Years ago, we had also apparently done the same with microcontroller B, but the vendor for B that could pre-program them for us had shut down, and we could not find a single other vendor who could preload the firmware for us. That's when we turned to internal solutions. Someone found out that the test jig at my station, then managed by someone else, had direct access to the microcontroller's programming interface, so they developed a way to flash the firmware from my test jig. That meant we could now buy blank B units directly from the manufacturer, then flash it with the firmware ourselves. This was a great solution because not only were blank B units cheaper, flashing it during powered-on testing wouldn't add an extra step to our production process since it would just be a part of the white box testing step. Of course, flashing the firmware required the unit to be powered on. All of this happened years before I had joined the company, and before most of the current crop of design engineers were involved with this project. This was, in fact, documented, but all of these products had gone through hundreds of ECNs, basically formal engineering notifications that something has changed with the product. And nobody was reading through hundreds of them to familiarize themselves with the entire history of the product. When they demanded I disable powered-on testing on all blue family products, this microcontroller programming step for Navy was also disabled, meaning any Navy units we built would make their way over to black box testing with a blank microcontroller. I knew, but that was only because I knew exactly what my test did. I also knew that this was documented in an ECN from 8 years ago. I was probably the only person involved that knew, and I didn't say a word. After several months of not building Navy, a new production run finally starts. The newly built units pass my white box, powered off testing. They then made their way over to black box testing and boom, 100% failure rate. What's more, this failure was a particularly tricky one because as far as the black box tester was concerned, the unit could not even turn on. The reason was that the microcontroller in question held the firmware that controlled power delivery for the entire electronic assembly, so without that firmware, nothing worked. No lights, no output, no fans, no nothing. Which means they had a hell of a time trying to figure out what the issue was. That entire department went into firefighting mode, with everyone losing their minds over why this product we had produced for nearly a decade with high yields was suddenly failing at a rate of 100%. Not me. I was happily running production for other products. It dragged on for months, with the design engineers pursuing a dozen different leads and all of them fizzling out. Surprisingly, nobody ever approached me because I guess their theory for everything was white box powered-on testing kills units, and now that they had already asked me to disable powered-on testing, they had no other theories for how I might have been affecting things. As far as they were aware, there was no problem with white box testing. I just sat back and pretended I wasn't even aware of what was going on while everything was melting down around me. The reveal. I decided that the moment someone asked me about it, I'd reveal everything. So several months down the line, when someone finally brought it up to me during casual conversation, I spilled it. Them. Hey, did you hear about all the Navy units not turning on at Black Box? Me. Oh no, I didn't. Could it be because we're no longer programming the microcontroller at White Box? Them. What? Me. What? Within a day, I was called into a meeting with everyone, my direct manager, his manager, a few of the other manufacturing engineers, quite a few program managers, the design engineering team, even a VP, and told to explain myself. Me. Well, I was told in no uncertain terms to disable powered-on testing a few months ago, and microcontroller programming is part of that process. I assumed that when the call was made, everyone was aware of the implications of taking such a drastic measure. I figured you had found a new vendor to pre-program the microcontroller bees or something. Design engineers. You never told us. Me. Yes, but I couldn't describe all of the hundreds of potential new failure modes skipping powered-on testing would now introduce. It would have taken me all week. The fact that Whitebox programs the microcontroller during powered-on testing is documented in ECN #2082. Didn't you read that? I got off scot-free from that meeting. However, this then led to the VP, who was a former engineer by the way, investigating why the design engineers had called for powered-on testing to be disabled, which revealed that 1. They had ignored my well-founded, technically sound opinion, despite the fact that I was supposed to be considered the subject matter expert on whitebox testing. 2. Disabling powered-on testing did not solve the issue. 3. Once powered-on testing was disabled, the failures at Black Box tripled, leaving us with a bunch of defective units that we didn't know how to fix. And 4. Once it became clear that the cause was not powered-on testing, they did not follow up and asked that it be re-enabled. I got a bit of flack for this part too, but in the end the VP agreed with my viewpoint that if I disabled powered-on testing and then heard nothing from the design engineers, I could assume the problem was resolved and had no need to follow up. In the end, nobody got fired or anything, but a few members of the design engineering team did receive a reprimand for their behavior during this entire event. For the entire time I was with that company, they tiptoed around me and never falsely blamed me for any issues again. The next one is an entitled people story. I've spoken before about the mortgaged fifth-wheel trailer my sister left us with, but this time it's finally gone. To start from the beginning, when my sister and her ex-husband separated, she came back to live with us, and took up residence with her kids in the old family camper trailer. After a couple of years, she convinced our grandparents to co-sign for a brand new fifth-wheel trailer, or at least it was supposed to be a cosign. No, she made them sign the mortgage under their names only. She was also supposed to look for a much cheaper used trailer, but she insisted on a brand new one like it was a hill to die on, and would act like she just wanted a presentable home for her kids. Sure, that trailer was presentable at first, but 5 years of being subjected to her and her pets and food hoarding just destroyed it. We kicked my sister out of the trailer about 2 years ago for not paying the mortgage and for treating us all like crap. We had to clean the trailer out, and the pet damage was extensive. Her dogs and cats had just destroyed the place by peeing, pooping, chewing, clawing, breaking, tearing. I've run out of words to describe it, but it was pretty bad. A whole lot of the food my sister hoarded was expired. Unopened ketchup is bad when it's brown inside the bottle. And my sister flipped out when we tossed all that expired food in the trash. And then she demanded back what was still good that had been saved, and I had to deliver it to the apartment of the drug dealer she was crashing with. It wasn't long after that I cut her off, but the post I made on that is a long read. We did everything we could to try and clean up the trailer, and we found numerous things inside it that pissed us off. For one thing, my 2 younger nephews that used to live with her didn't have enough blankets in winter. When we were cleaning out that trailer after booting out my sister, we discovered she had a lot of extra blankets hidden under the bed in the master bedroom, and even a brand new unopened sleeping bag, all of which my nephews could have used. We were so pissed. Not only did she not supply them with more blankets, she didn't even buy them winter clothes in 2023. I said this in several prior posts, but I had to buy clothes for my 2 younger nephews so they wouldn't freeze. My youngest nephew came to me shivering and wearing nothing but shorts and a t-shirt in 39 degrees because he missed the school bus. We're lucky the school didn't report something after seeing him dressed like that. Another thing that we found in that damn trailer was evidence of one of the affairs my sister had while still married. We know of roughly 3 affairs. The first was with an independent producer who convinced my sister she could be famous. The second was with one of our third cousins. And it was evidence of that affair we found in the trailer, in a notebook in which she wrote things about said cousin and circled it with a heart. The third affair was possibly with teenagers, and my sister begged our parents to bring her a morning after pill for it. They found her in the park with 2 teenage boys. There were possibly other affairs, but we don't have any proof, and my sister had the audacity to cry to me for years that she'd never cheated and doesn't do that sort of stuff. As far as I'm aware, she still thinks I don't know. The damage to the trailer my sister caused was so extensive that a dealership refused to take it unless we sold it for next to nothing. According to the dealership, pet damage, urine damage, rust damage, dry rot, floor delamination, roof damage, water damage, carpet damage, appliances needed repair, 1 TV broken, needed new tires even though they were brand new with the trailer. The septic tank was and still is full of years of crap because it was never emptied. The exterior awning was broken, and weather damage from my sister constantly leaving an exterior storage panel open because it had a mini fridge where she kept her beer. The guy from the dealership also claimed to have smelled mold, even though we'd cleaned every inch of that trailer. We'd even hired a professional steam cleaner to clean the trailer. We replaced most of the internal doors, repainted the vent covers, repaired the screen door, replaced the water heater and a specific sensor, and several other repairs my grandparents made. I personally repainted the vent covers, which in retrospect we should have just gotten new ones. But I repaired and repainted them anyway because my grandpa asked me to. A couple of them required JB weld and straightening with a hammer. We thought we'd fixed up the trailer enough. A dealership had it picked up. We said, "Bye, Felicia," to it, and then days later it was back. The dealership said it needed $25,000 in repairs and didn't want it unless we sold it for $4,000. The damn thing still had around $50 owed on it. We were practically tearing our hair out trying to figure out what to do about the trailer because it'd destroy my grandparents' credit if they defaulted, and the bank could still potentially come after them for the debt. Then an older cousin of ours from California stepped in and said he'd buy it because he's got a second property in Southern Oregon without a house on it, and he loves a project. Now he's taken over the payments and made numerous more repairs. The other day, though, he finally hauled that damn trailer out of here. He didn't take it far, just to my grandparents' house. But it's not on our property anymore, and it's not coming back this time. Hallie ducking Luja. My cousin, though, he kind of broke one of the rear windows on his truck, turning the trailer too tight. That trailer is just cursed. Either way, we're just super glad the trailer is gone. Every time we looked at it, it brought us misery remembering what my sister put us through while she lived in it. Currently, my sister is jobless for over 2 years now, drug addicted and only surviving off the kindness of her only 2 remaining friends, both of which are almost as bad as she is. Anyway, thank you for watching.